Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. As Christopher said, my name's Katlyn, and I'm going to talk to you guys today about a few paradigms within our systems that I think if we want to have that oh shit moment of clarity before we think forward, it would be prudent to do so. So, the title of my talk is here, Shifting Systems, Paradigms of Waste, Equity, and Consumption. And that gives you a bit of a hint of what we're going to chat about today. So as Christopher said, I think it is really important to consider the past. And so although he introduced me a little bit, I'll just say a little bit about who I am. I think positionality is very important when we think about how we view the world. So I'm currently a systems engineer and a researcher. I work at MIT at the Media Lab, and I also have a boutique consulting company called KTLN. But it's taken me a bit to get to that spot. So I grew up in the United States in the middle of the country in a state, Indiana. Those of you who are familiar with like Mike Pence or Pete Buttigieg, kind of two sides of the same coin, are both from Indiana, very close to where I grew up. I am a racial and ethnic minority in a part of the country that is not very open to that. But one side of my family is Caucasian and one side of my family is African American. And so growing up, observational kind of equity was very present in the front of my mind. I would notice things like, why does mom get to act this way? Why does dad get to act this way, right? So I think just without having the words for that, that was quite important and shaped how I thought about things. As Christopher said, I studied at a few universities in the United States, and the thing that I think has really just shaped my entire trajectory is the fact that from the moment I was really like 5 years old, some of us, I think if you're in that millennial generation, you'll identify with this. We've all just been hearing, oh shit, our whole lives, right? It's like, oh, global warming. I think the first time I heard that term, I was 5. I had no idea what global warming was, right? But in the United States, we've had a pretty dated medical system for a long time, right? When I was in college, the idea that if you had a pre-existing conditions could be anything from like having had cancer or just simply being pregnant, that maybe you wouldn't get insurance, right? So those are the sort of paradigms that I grew up with and have kind of questioned a lot. I studied environmental science and nuclear waste. The part of the country I grew up in has a lot of nuclear energy and is a sort of a discussion area for where to consider nuclear waste. And I know that actually some of that work did bring me to Sweden at times, because you guys have a lot of discussion about nuclear waste here and nuclear energy. But yeah, I think as was said, positionality is important. And so I hope you can maybe think about that and think about your own positionality as I'm considering these things. So the question that our curator Hildreth posed is essentially, if we have to think of a paradigm or an assumption that is so ingrained in our systems that it really affects everything to the point that it's invisible, we can't easily identify it, what would it look like to look at that straight in the eye, be honest about it, think about how we might want to change it, and think about why we might want to change it. And so I work in the environmental sector, right? And so I'm sure many of you in the European Union have heard of this framework, this twin transitions framework that the EU has adopted. And so to think back, to think about this oh shit in the past, I'm actually going to have us think forward first. So if you don't know what this is, the twin transitions is a framework that suggests that for the 21st century, we should sort of pair the transition of away from carbon dioxide-based energy infrastructure and manufacturing infrastructure, and also we should pair this with the digital transition to data, AI, devices, things like that. So in a twin transitions paradigm, and the US uses this too, but we don't name it so explicitly, but it's a part of our strategic plan as well, and many other countries in the global north use this. We're talking about, moving away from things like coal and oil and gas towards things like nuclear, wind, solar, things like electric vehicles. Everyone gets a Tesla. And then also at the same time, the presence of devices continuing to be super important, and who knows what could be next in that realm, maybe more wearables and things like that, the integration of data. But then also just, AI. We're in the middle of the AI summer right now. Everyone knows suddenly AI is everywhere. In the US, I don't know if you guys know this, you can't actually opt out of AI. It's just there. You have to kind of use it for everything. So that's the twin transitions, right? And everyone really kind of says that this is quite a radical framework, and in some ways it really is, right? We're shifting how we'd provide energy, how we would provide things as simple as opening a door. Maybe we won't open the door, but we'll press the button on the phone and the phone will open the door. That's pretty radical if we think about it. But there are a lot of embedded assumptions that are from deep in the past that I think it's important to consider when we're thinking about this framework and thinking about how we could move forward. And so, questions, right? What are the embedded assumptions that I want to talk about today? And what paradigms did this framework rely upon that are actually quite old? So from my perspective and my positionality, there are at least three, and they're related. One is when we think about how to define environmental impact. Another is if we're answering this question of for whom are we thinking about with the twin transitions. And the third is when we're thinking about waste, byproducts of this twin transition, and also the concept of equity, the role that equity plays. So first, environmental impact. I'm not talking about COVID here. I don't want to bring us back to the dark ages, but just to make an analogy. So if you remember in 2020, how did the world really define health? We defined it with one simple metric, right? Because we were in a state of emergency. And that metric was very simply COVID. Do you have COVID? Okay, if you have it, are you in the hospital? Are you on a ventilator? Do you not have it? Are you at risk for having it? And that was really what, if we think about public health, if we think about science, if we think about education, childcare, that was really how the world thought of health, right? We all know that that's not holistically what health is, right? It's one variable, it's one piece of health. And it was admittedly during an emergency, right? So we had to focus on it, right? But for a long time in the environmental sector, for at least 50 years now, we've thought of environmental impact in a very similar way. So if you think about how we talk about environmental impact, it's either carbon dioxide, just purely, or maybe it's greenhouse gases, so we might include methane as well. But this is one variable. Just like this was one variable of health, and you could also have mental health, you could have cancer, you could have physical health, you could have all these different things. Environmental impact, as we define it as greenhouse gases, is simply one variable, right? And so our systems, our policy systems, our scientific systems, our corporate systems, really, when they're trying to focus on environmental impact, this is what they mean. They mean this. And this is not necessarily bad, not arguing that we shouldn't focus on CO2, but there are some consequences of this paradigm where, because it's not in the narrow frame of what's defined, we actually, it's not that we don't care. As individuals, we care, but our systems can't really respond to it. So a few examples here. On the left, you can see an explosion from the Fukushima Daiichi reactor, which was in, 2011, 2012 now. So that had tremendous environmental impact, right? We had a tsunami, we had thousands of people killed, we had a nuclear reactor meltdown like the worst since Chernobyl, we had radioactive material out into the air, into the oceans, into the land. But did we increase CO2 from that? No, not really, right? And so when we consider that, we consider it as an accident, we consider it as a tragedy, we consider it as something bad, but we don't consider it as necessarily environmental impacts such that we might want to make a systemic change globally about it. In the middle, I'm showing a picture of what lithium mining and cobalt mining looks like in the Congo. So you can see here lots of environmental impact in this picture. Environmental impact when we think about humans, when we think about labor, and actually mining does emit a lot of CO2 and greenhouse gases and related toxins. But again, that kind of mining fuels these twin transitions. We need those materials in order to have EVs and devices and things like that. So we can't really think about it as environmental impact. And on the right, I'm showing a very cute cow. I think it's cute. But so consumption is a paradigm, right? So when we think about beef, for example, or the animal agriculture sector, a lot of the solutions we're thinking about are like, how do we get cows to emit less methane so that we can still raise them? And that, because we're focusing on methane, is the paradigm we want to focus on. But we're not thinking about like the deforestation of agriculture and how that affects CO2 even, or how that affects other sort of pollutants. We're not thinking about animal welfare. We're not thinking about labor, any of that, right? So this is a consequence. So when we define the problem as CO2, or even greenhouse gases generally, it means that like any solution we come up with, what's totally allowed is we can create, we can sustain, we can exacerbate other serious issues. That's totally fine. And that, I think, should be kind of an oh shit moment for all of us. It also means that when you're an individual or a group that's trying to advocate for and give voice to these other very real types of environmental impact, we have a tendency to shut that down. How many of you have ever heard of, like, you know, the war between sort of environmental justice and like mainstream climate movements, where people who are, you know, living in marginalized communities all around the world focus on things like pollution, clean water, the fact that they're experiencing brownouts from things like the AI data centers, or, you know, other sorts of infrastructure. But we don't think about this as climate activism. We think of it as environmental justice, right? And we actually shut down these conversations in kind of a cruel way sometimes, and we gaslight people into thinking that they don't actually care about our world when they do. So that's one. The second paradigm I think we want to talk about is this for whom question. So this is like, you know, a cool techie picture of what the twin transitions could look like, charging centers and devices and all of that. But what we don't often talk about is like, who gets this? Not everybody gets this, right? If you're in Sweden, we probably get this. If we're in the United States, we probably get this. But if you're in one of these countries that's red, or if you're colorblind, the ones that are kind of below on the page in the global south, you don't actually get this. And that's kind of the definition of this framework. We don't talk about it. We don't say like, you know, oh, yeah, screw these people in the global south, but that is the implicit definition of for whom that we're answering, right? So in the north, if we take the example of critical raw materials, which in the United States we call critical minerals, we have lots of policies, you know, scientific endeavors, and norms that are being developed to ensure that our countries have a stable supply of these materials. So in the EU, we have the Critical Raw Materials Act. In the United States, we have the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act. I like this Canadian maple leaf. Each tine of the leaf is like a different mineral. So it's like we've made this really cute. We're like, yeah, let's do this. All of these will power our things. But what this actually means for the Global South in particular, and for some places within Global North, in the US, for example, on Indigenous land, and Canada on Indigenous land, this is a big deal. It means all of this. It means human rights labor, human rights violations with labor, child labor, slave labor. It means taking over land that, once again, we've been told over and over again, you know, was not our land to steward or to exploit or to violate. It means mine tailings. This is like a pond that's been contaminated by arsenic, which is a common nasty toxin that emerges from mining. And so that's actually what this means, right? If we're going to like go towards this future, this is what we're gonna get as well. And when we're talking about that, when we're talking about twin transitions, when we're talking about you know, the variant of that in the US, which is not so explicitly packaged, the implicit sort of assumption is that this is okay as long as it gives us this. And so, yeah, this question of for whom is another, I think, that should be oh shit, right? It's very easy to look around and be like, we're all here. We're all at the conference. We're all here. Like we're included in this, right? But most people around the world are not. And so even if you don't care about it from a moral or ethical standpoint, from a policy and from an action standpoint, right? There are really, examples of, and nuclear waste in the United States is a great example of this, where communities that have been marginalized, that have been kind of pushed around or left out of procedural justice or distributive justice or whatever it is, are able to push back and say, actually, we don't want this mine here. It's not going to happen. And so we really actually need to listen, right? I'm in climate spaces often where people will say things like, oh, we don't have time to listen, like this will take a long time, we don't have time to build trust, we don't have time to consider how this might look. And what I would say is actually we don't have time to not do it. If we're thinking about many sort of examples of industry, of quote unquote innovation related to this sector, we see over and over again all over the world examples of communities that agglomerate into regions or just action groups that are able to make real action here. They're able to stop things from happening. They're able to change norms and policies and prevent things from being built. And so what I would say is that if we actually do care about environmental impact and about digital infrastructure, we should listen, and we should think about how to redefine this. So questions we might interrogate are things like, who's included in this framework? What roles are different groups or different countries or different, communities expected or supposed to play, different classes of laborers, different socioeconomic classes, who is supposed to benefit, who is, it's okay, like it's regrettable, but it's sad, it's okay if they're harmed, right? Who is like not supposed to benefit, who is not supposed to be harmed, like what are the boundaries here? And who and what are kind of the main stakeholders? Stakeholders, whether that's like a person, whether that's an economic system as a stakeholder, whether that's a literal business as a stakeholder, right? What are we each supposed to get? Those are questions we should think about. And the last one, this idea of waste, byproducts, and equity. So if I would pose this question that, if we shifted our system, if we move forward into this twin transitions and we really embrace it, and go to its idealized state where we have a full green and digital infrastructure, what is the vision? What is included as part of that? So I hope that I would be in the Tesla, right? I hope I'd be going to ski somewhere, but what's on the right is also included. So when we think about the mining needs that we have now, the mining needs of doing a full transition, are exponentially higher. So you're going to have more land, you're going to have more pollutants, you're going to have more water, things that cause asthma, MS, other sorts of illnesses. There's going to be more of it. We're going to have ChatGPT, perhaps in our brains, but certainly on our phones and certainly on our computers. Artificial intelligence will certainly be available, and maybe it'll be available whether you're in Malma or whether you're in Southern Africa or Antarctica or wherever you are, and that's amazing, right? But what comes with it is these brownouts, right? These AI, the generative AI capabilities and infrastructure, that's the sort of electrical infrastructure that it requires, right? And so, yeah, both, right? It's maybe we'll be looking like ChatGPT, where is Malma? Tell me the history of Malma. But then also, it will be sitting in darkness, right? And maybe that's okay, but maybe it's not, and we should be honest about it. We will certainly, in this paradigm, have things like new kinds of energy or even old kinds of energy, such as nuclear, scaled up, right? And that energy will certainly not produce CO2 to the same extent. But when we think about nuclear, one sector, right, which is generally considered to be safe, right, asterisk, safe, in 80 years of the nuclear sector, we've had 3 major accidents. If we were to scale up nuclear to the point where it's defraying 1/10 of our carbon emissions, we'd probably have 5 to 6 more accidents. Those are random events that render entire areas of land uninhabitable, give kids cancer, all of that, right? We might have beef cows that are emitting less methane because they're eating seaweed instead of grass or corn. But we're also going to have all this land be deforested, right, to make way for agriculture so we can all go to our Michelin-starred restaurants. We might be able to take really awesome vacations and like, have cool wine and pictures and outfits. But then this is also happening, right? Overpopulation, places where people are living completely at a different level and standard. So we have to interrogate this question of, what does it mean to have it all? What does it mean to be green? What does it mean to be digital, right? From the perspective of all of this. And I don't want to give you like an answer to this because it's a complicated answer. And so the one answer I would offer is that we really need to just hold the complexity of the problem. We know that fossil fuels are bad. They've caused a lot of harm. But what does it mean for us if we are to replace a system that we know is bad with something that creates just as much impact but is just different? It's a different kind of impact, right? And all of us, like, if you care about climate and all of that, we want very badly to believe that this new system is just going to solve all our problems, right? We feel guilty, most of us, if you're like liberal-minded at all or just climate-minded, no matter what your affiliation is. We might feel guilty like every time we take a car, every time we get on a plane, every time we have meat. But if we're shifting to this other system, it's actually like we might take the guilt away. It's like, oh, I can do this because it's okay, it's green. But it's green as defined by this one paradigm, right? Not completely. So what I would leave you with is that humans really have had always had some form of inequity, waste, byproducts, and we've always found a way to make that acceptable, right? We've always found a way to say like, well, it's okay if that happens here, because these people are this race or this ethnicity or this religion, or these people are not educated or whatever it is. We've always found a way to just sort of be like, this is fine as long as it doesn't happen here. But that is actually like the oldest paradigm in the book, that if we're thinking about wanting to shift systems, I think that's where we should start. It's hard, and there are not easy solutions. There are not even one-size-fits-all solutions, but shifting our thinking to that point is the way to go. And I would say that this requires a lot of bravery, to be honest, because again, this is such a entrenched paradigm. It's something that we don't think about, and yet we benefit from every day. And so that's it. I'll leave you with that. Thank you.